All right, we're going to discuss a little bit about plant breeding. Now, this isn't necessarily designed to teach you how to breed plants, but some of the benefits, the struggles, and the challenges, and the pros and cons of different ways of breeding plants. So there's two basic types of plant breeding. There's asexual reproduction, which a single parent produces all of the progeny. And all of those progeny are genetically identical to the parent. So you might think of cuttings or splitting, dividing a plant into a couple of pieces. And then there's sexual reproduction, where you have two parents, a male and a female is how we typically think of it. And those progeny are genetically diverse. In other words, each child, each baby plant is a little bit different from the parents. Just kind of how it works in animals. There are pros and cons to both of this. If you are, from a plant perspective, the pros are, if you reproduce asexually, your progeny are highly adapted to the area where you are. It's fantastic if there's not a lot of other individuals nearby. In other words, you don't need an individual nearby. You can colonize rapidly. It's because it's very, very fast reproduction. The challenges are, of course, as your progeny get further and further away from the main parent, the environment may be different. So they're not more adapted to different environments because they're very specifically adapted to one environment. And if something bad happens, a disease or an insect, every single individual is negatively impacted and doesn't necessarily have the ability to adapt to those sorts of conditions. Same thing with sexual reproduction. The nice thing is it's very genetically diverse, which means your progeny can perhaps colonize different locations. Some progeny will be more adapted to a different location. Some progeny may be less adapted to a new location. You can usually produce huge numbers of babies. It does allow you to move all over the place. It is a little slower than asexual reproduction. Basically, in terms of how long it takes for a plant to go to flower, especially when we're talking about our perennials, things that live longer than a couple of years. It may take those plants 7 or 8 or 9 years to become reproductive age. It also doesn't work if you're isolated. So if you're the only apple tree in an area, there are no other apple trees nearby, you are not doing sexual reproduction. So it can be a lot slower, even if you are, in theory, producing many, many more babies. So let's think about it. Mutations. Are they a pro? Are they a con? Usually we think of them as bad. In fact, most genetic mutations won't survive. So think about superheroes. We've got Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Those are mutations where it's positive. Many of our graphic novel heroes, X-Men in particular, are mutations. They have some sort of genetic variant that gives them superpowers. While the world may think of those as negative things, those are actually mutations that were perhaps positive. They'd allowed them to do things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. The reality is, most of those types of mutations, the animal, the plant, would not survive. So, what is a mutation? A mutation is any change in the DNA. Most mutations are bad. We've kind of discussed that. But they can be inconsequential. In other words, they don't have any benefit. The animal, the organism, the plant doesn't even know that they're there. They can be beneficial. Sometimes they're kind of cool mutations. So if you get a cool mutation, so we can take a look, particularly some of these like this. Variegation is often a mutation. You can look at this orange and see that the bottom half is a little bit darker. You can look at this iris and so we've got half that's purple and half that's yellow. There's a hibiscus that's half pink and half white. So there are some cool things that do happen with mutations. In people, lots and lots of mutations are bad. Think of the genetic mutation that caused sickle cell disease. That's a genetic change. It's not that that's fatal, but it certainly does make it very difficult to live with. Mostly inconsequential mutation in human beings would be color blindness. Yeah, you can live with color blindness, but it is something that is a little bit different, and it's not something that can easily be fixed. So there are some examples of harmless ones, even in animals. All right, so here's a couple of examples. You can divide large plants into smaller segments. You can take cuttings off of things. A lot of people have perhaps taken a houseplant and thrown it into a glass of water to watch the roots grow. So those are all examples of asexual propagation. Here's another type of asexual propagation. This one is called grafting. You take the top part of one plant and you attach it to the bottom part of another plant. Roses, weeping plants, some upright plants, many of our trees have done this. So our growers, our breeders are doing this. The image here is an example of a bud being stuck onto another stem, and once that takes, then that will be the main plant. Okay, so I have some examples here showing grafting and where it comes in handy. We often see it with fruit trees. So the image on the left is a fruit tree that's been grafted onto another portion. So you take the stems, which is the green parts that you're seeing there, and you graft it onto a trunk or a root system of the lower portion. Over on the right-hand side, you can see right just below where the arrow is, a change in the coloration of the trunk. So I can draw a line right across where that graft is. And that's where the weeping portion has been attached to a regular trunk. Doesn't always work very well. Doesn't always work well. So here are some examples of what we call graft failure, or what is officially called graft incompatibility, where even if the graft takes, after a while, it doesn't work. So here's an example here that you can see with this tree, and there's a lot more stuff from the top, photosynthate, sugars, etc., moving down toward the bottom than that bottom system is able to handle. So the trunk is getting larger and larger. Here you have where the reverse is actually true. So the bottom is producing more than the top is able to take. Let that go long enough and things can fail, plants can fall. We call that graft failure. So you can see that probably took several years to build up. That tree lived a long time, and then the graft failed. It does happen every once in a while. Sometimes there are diseases that occur, sometimes there are viruses and things like that that cause it, but a lot of times the graft just fails after a while. Right, so now we need to know a little bit about flowers. This is not an anatomy class, so I'm not saying that you need to know everything there is to know about plant anatomy, but you do need to understand some of the basic terms. So a complete flower has all of the reproductive parts. An incomplete flower obviously then is lacking one or more parts, and I'm just going to cross that off and pretend that I spelled that properly. Dioecious plants have separate male and female plants. So that's important because you need to have two plants to produce the fruit. Monoecious plants have separate male and female flowers, but they're on the same plant. It's also helpful to know if your plant is wind-pollinated, insect-pollinated. Does it need to be cross-pollinated, or can it self-pollinate? An example there might be apples. Apples must be cross-pollinated. They cannot pollinate themselves. So to get apples on your apple trees, you need two different apple plants. Wind-pollinated flowers, we can make some guesses about some of these. Wind-pollinated flowers tend to be small. They're not usually as pretty. Sometimes they have lots and lots of pollen associated with them. Most of the trees that are wind pollinated will produce lots and lots of pollen. Think about that when it comes to folks that have allergies, but they need to have lots of pollen because they don't know where their pollen is going to end up. So if we watch this, all of that yellow is pollen, all waiting to cause allergies. Actually, it's not waiting to cause allergies, it's waiting to make new plants. You'll see most of our flowers, most of the things that we find pretty as far as flowers are concerned, actually are things that we find very beautiful. Insects tend to find them beautiful as well, although they don't always see the exact same things that we see. So here will be flowers under UV radiation, and this is what insects see. Vastly different from what we see, because they see in a different range of light than we do. Now, what is the impact on this for breeding? Because that's what we really are concerned about, is the impact for breeding. Now, if you're hand pollinating, you're going to breed your own. And how do you prevent wind or insects from pollinating? A lot of folks who do hand pollination will simply put bags over their plants. Sometimes you don't need to do that, because once the hybridization process actually takes place, the plant cannot be pollinated again. But you have to control your own hybrids and your crosses. Other people just let Mother Nature take its course and see what results. Classical breeding is deliberately crossing our plants. You take this plant A and you take the pollen from it and you put it on plant B because you think that you'll get some interesting results from that. Flower color, height, whatever that might be. We can also do this in a lab, in a tissue culture lab, which we call tissue culture or micropropagation. So you can clone the plants from other parts of the plant. You can also do a cross, and especially for plants that seed production takes a very long time. Some plants can take up to 2 years before the seed even begins to germinate. Well, that's a long time. It's too long of a time for most nurseries and garden centers and growers to spend taking care of that. But if you can rescue that embryo out of the seed and then grow it in the lab, you can bypass the natural processes that the plant has. Today, of course, we do genetic engineering, and we will see a guest lecturer on genetic and or bioengineering, if you want to call it that. It's yet another tool for making more plants and making plants do more of what we want rather than leaving it to chance. Also, pros and cons of these sorts of things. Sometimes it's a little slower. We often have unintended effects. We can have unintended effects with traditional breeding. Traditional breeding might have less controversy. Traditional breeding, basically anybody could do it. If I had 2 plants in my garden, I could do cross-pollination if I wanted to, and the setup is simpler. With genetic engineering, you can replicate lots and lots of plants. The scientists know exactly the genes that they're looking for and exactly where to put them. Yes, we can have unintended effects. That, of course, you can happen at any time. There's a lot of controversy. It kind of depends upon your area of interest and area of focus. Some folks find genetic engineering controversial, others don't. It's just the way it is. But you do have to have specialized knowledge, and it is a much more complicated setup. We've already discussed some plant breeders' rights, right? But we also know that we have limited food crops. This is probably more important for our food crops than for our ornamental crops. And don't get me wrong, as a gardener, I love a variety in my ornamentals. But we're not making any more food production land, any more arable land. All the arable land that there is out there. So what we're doing is we're growing crops on increasingly poor land. So we need crops that are more tolerant to that. Can we increase the nutritional value? Can we create colors of ornamental plants that are not seen? Daylilies, for example. There's no blue daylily. Somebody please genetically engineer a blue daylily, because I'd spend $1 zillion on that. Can we save species decimated by insects and or disease? Everybody might know of the emerald ash borer. Well, they're looking at genetics to see if we can genetically engineer our native ashes to be resistant to that. What you need to think about is there's lots and lots of new ways to get plants. None of these, from my perspective, are right. None of them are wrong. They are all just different ways to get new plants. There are pros and cons that work for all methods, and you need to use whatever works for you, your company, your business, or your situation. As always, if you have questions, please do not hesitate to get in touch.